The left-hand image is an advertisement in a lumber trade journal. This wasn't for the general public, but it was in American Lumberman. And you can see there's Lafayette's image of Bunyan. See how huge he is. They stamped that circular logo on every piece of wood they sold and on every piece of stationery they sent out. And as you can see, Paul Bunyan even went off to World War I in their advertisements. So this got Bunyan known in the lumber trade. This is Lafayette's 1922 edition of the book. The pamphlet kept coming out. Whenever they ran out of them, they'd print some more. And it was part stories, part product catalog. And it was Lafayette who made up the name Babe for the Blue Ox. Before that, the ox didn't have any name. Nobody had any characters had any names. And Lafayette makes up all the names we all know. There's the 4 different versions of his pamphlet from 1914 to from 1922 to 1944 that went out. And they were not a book publisher. They would just send lists free to anybody they wanted. And they didn't copyright it because they figured anybody who used it would just be publicizing their products. So they didn't copyright it. Anybody could take these stories. And since they were supposed to be folklore, anybody can make up folklore, right? So there was no restriction, no intellectual property rights in their version of Bunyan. So what happened was, in 1922, the Kansas City Star took their pamphlet and put most of its stories in a huge double-page spread, which you see on the left, and they credited, they said where they got them, they credited Red River and said, geez, this is great, saving lumberjack folklore. But somebody unscrupulous saw that, typed them out on his own, and sent them to the Century magazine in New York. The Century magazine was sort of like Harper's or The Atlantic. It was a literary magazine for intellectuals in the 20s. And he passed them off as his own work, and this is how Bunyan got known to people who could publish books in the East, the Northeast. Another person who saw that Kansas City Star article was a logger named James Stevens. Stevens had grown up in the Midwest, was expelled from high school for chewing tobacco in the 9th grade, never went back, just went west, became a miner and a hobo and a logger, but he always wanted to be a writer, really. And he admired H.L. Mencken, a great modernist of the teens and 20s. And he wrote to Mencken when he heard Mencken was starting that magazine, the American Mercury. And he said, I've got some stories about Paul Bunyan. And Mencken said, great, send me the stories. And he loved them. So the stories got printed in this magazine and then turned into a book published by Alfred Knopf. Stevens became an instant sensation in 1925 as the lumberjack author. At the same time, there was a woman named Esther Shepard who was a scholar out in the University of Washington. She was doing her master's thesis, and she started collecting Bunyan stories. And she wrote a book too. The 2 books, I think I have them here next. Yeah, there are 2 versions of Bunyan, both appeared in the summer of 1925. And Stevens was this uneducated guy who tried to write polished literary prose. So he turned Bunyan into like a fictional character. Shepard was a scholar who knew how to write real prose, but she thought the story should be told in lumberjack dialect. So she wrote the dialect she didn't know. Stevens was writing polished prose, which he couldn't do. And the books are pretty laughable today. But they went head to head in 1925 and for the next 20 years. In fact, they're both still in print today. The reason for that was that in the 1920s, what do you think of the 1920s? The Roaring Twenties and Great Gatsby and bathtub gin and tremendous excitement. Well, the publishing industry in America in the 1920s was dominated by these old farts who'd been around since the 1870s, except for 2 upstart companies, each one of which published one of these books. So booksellers and readers were always looking for the hardcore books each year. Probably the most important book of 1925 was The Great Gatsby. It sold 30,000 copies over the next 20 years. And look at Bunyan. Lovehead and Shepard and Stevens together sold 600,000. But everybody started publishing Bunyan books in the 20s. And so it's actually surely more than 1 million copies of Bunyan stories floated out into the world. In 1927, the Sunday supplement to the Hearst newspapers included this very big, full-page, double-page spread about Paul Bunyan, mythical hero of the logging camps. They mentioned Wisconsin and Madison here because Charles Brown was teaching the Bunyan stories at the university at the time. There were several million, what does it say there? 4 million? 4.7 million copies of that went out. Now, the reason Bunyan became popular in the 20s has a lot to do with international politics. Before the First World War, America was isolated and thought to be sort of second-rate. But then in 1914, the First World War starts, and England and France get on one side of those trenches, and Germany and Austria get on the other side, and they just start beating each other up year after year, and nobody can win. And then in 1918, the Americans come in, tip the scales, and history changes. And all of a sudden, America was on the world stage. And Americans had a great pride in themselves and what they could do. They needed a hero to rank with Hercules and Thor. And lo and behold, just at that moment, who comes out of the Northwoods but Paul Bunyan? And so tremendous stories start being made about Bunyan. And everybody embraces him as a native American hero. The first children's books come in the 1920s. They're terrible. They're really bad. You may have some here, but you should look at them. They'd be fun. And then in the 1930s, the advertising starts. What happens in 1929 in America? Yeah, right, the Depression, right. So the bottom falls out of the economy. And Bunyan starts to turn into this hero that anybody can use. During the Depression, labor unions and radicals on the left in their journal, New Masses, hold Bunyan up as the example of the sturdy, noble proletarian. And if only all those bankers and corporate executives would get out of the way, Bunyan could fix everything. At the same time, Forbes magazine, the journal of business and industry leaders, holds Bunyan up as the example of the self-reliant, hardy American worker who needs no help from unions or the New Deal. So everybody starts to turn Bunyan into anything they want. During that same decade, up north, all the trees are gone. There's no economy. The economy has totally tanked up north. But they think maybe tourism could bring people north. And towns from Maine to Seattle start using Bunyan as a tourist attraction. The one on the upper left there is from Escanaba, Michigan. The colored one upper right is Bemidji, I think. And that's when the restaurants and the statues start popping up. There's a PhD dissertation from 2 or 3 years ago about the Bunyan and the tourism industry. That's kind of fascinating because as far south as Arizona, people were claiming Paul Bunyan in order to get business to come to their towns. This is a map of all of Bunyan's exploits that was used as a placemat in restaurants. During World War II, the little book, which is about the size of a 3x5 card on the upper left, was Stevens' stories, uncut, but it was designed in this format to fit into shirt pockets and backpacks and distributed to the troops. The edition on the right of Shepherd came out in paperback soon afterwards, and they continue to go head to head. After World War II, the lumberjacks are all dead, right? They just didn't live that long. Guys who'd been in the woods in the 1870s and 80s, they weren't around in the 1950s. And most people couldn't remember a wilderness experience at all. And Bunyan gets seized as the icon of anything that's big and strong. So you have Paul Bunyan beer. If you open a brand new drive-in movie, 1950s art form, well, if you want to emphasize how big you are, you say you're the Paul Bunyan drive-in movie. The Green Giant, you can see, is derived from Paul Bunyan, or so they said. Paul Bunyan bread. If you look at the second story of the big picture in the middle, you can see sporting goods were used. Paul Bunyan was used to advertise sporting goods. A friend sent me that last fall. It's still visible in Seattle on that building. Of course, the Boy Scouts adopted Paul Bunyan. There are all sorts of Paul Bunyan chapters, and there are patches and hats, all kinds of masculine gear needed, and comic books. So after World War II, Paul Bunyan makes the transition to children's literature, because you have these fantastic tales that are like fairy tales, and there's nobody around who can remember the real Paul Bunyan. The upper left there is a Disney cartoon. It's on YouTube. You can watch it. It's kind of fun. And that put Bunyan into the minds of millions of Americans. Anybody remember this Disney cartoon? If you watch it on YouTube, it'll come back to you. He also gets canonized in the best of children's